My name is Claire Whitfield. I spent the first 30 years of my life being the daughter my father forgot to be proud of. That changed the night my uncle stood up at Thanksgiving and announced that my college savings, every dollar my grandmother had quietly set aside for me, should go to fund my cousin Derek's genius application to MIT. He's going to change the world, my uncle said, while my aunt looked at me across the table like I was a minor inconvenience. Your girl can figure something out. She always does. 3 weeks later, when I refused, my father looked me in the eye and said I was being selfish. My aunt called me jealous. And my cousin Derek, 17 years old, blazer ironed, future mapped out, said nothing at all. Just smiled into his mashed potatoes. Last spring, Derek asked me for a job. I'll get back to that. But first, you need to understand where this story starts. Not with the money. Not with MIT. It starts with a house in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and a grandfather who believed daughters were a temporary arrangement. The Whitfield family home sits on a quiet street in the Midtown neighborhood of Tulsa, a 2-story brick colonial with white shutters and a porch that wraps around the front. My grandfather built it in 1971. My grandmother painted every room herself. The living room is still the color she chose, a warm cream that my father always said looked too feminine. He repainted his study gray the week after she moved into memory care. I grew up in that house on weekends and holidays. My father was one of 3 children. There was him, the oldest. Then my Uncle Ray, 6 years younger, the one who got the family business when my grandfather retired. And then my Aunt Donna, the youngest, who married well and spent her whole life making sure everyone knew it. My father, I'll call him Dad because that's what I called him even when he didn't deserve it, was a decent man in the way that mediocre men often are. He worked, he showed up, he paid the bills. What he never did was look at me like I had a future worth investing in. That particular quality of attention he saved for my cousin Derek, my Uncle Ray's only son. Derek Whitfield was everything the family needed him to be. Tested gifted at age 8. Debate team captain by 14. The kind of kid who won regional science competitions and had the plaques to prove it, lined up above his desk in chronological order of importance. My Uncle Ray talked about Derek, the way some men talk about stock portfolios, constantly, competitively, with an undercurrent of threat. And me? I was Claire. I got good grades. Not exceptional, not the kind you put on the refrigerator with a gold star, but solid. Consistent. I ran track for 2 years before a stress fracture ended that. I liked writing, I liked history. I wanted to study journalism at the State University and eventually work in documentary film. My father thought that was impractical. Not in those words. He never used direct words when a dismissive pause would do the same job. He'd nod slowly when I talked about my plans, the way you nod at a child explaining an imaginary friend. Patient, tolerant, faintly sorry for them. My grandmother, though. My grandmother, Ruth Whitfield, saw me. She was a small woman, barely 5'2", with silver hair she kept pinned up and reading glasses she wore on a beaded chain around her neck. She'd taught second grade for 31 years. She believed, fundamentally and without apology, that the quietest person in the room usually had the most to say. She'd pull me into the kitchen during family gatherings and ask me what I was reading. She kept a notebook of my ideas. Things I told her in passing that she'd written down and saved. Once, when I was 15, I told her I wanted to make documentaries about forgotten people. Stories that history had overlooked. She put her hand over mine and said, "That's not a hobby, Claire. That's a calling." 2 years before she was diagnosed with Alzheimer's, she updated her will. I didn't know that until much later. By the time her mind started to go, she'd already done what she needed to do. She left me $48,000 in an educational trust. She left Derek nothing because Derek's father was wealthy and Ruth Whitfield was precise about where her small fortune would do the most good. The Thanksgiving I'm about to describe happened the fall of my senior year of high school. I was 17. Derek was also 17. We're 6 months apart in age, something my Uncle Ray had always framed as a competition I was losing. The acceptance letter from MIT had arrived in October. Not an acceptance. A likely letter, the kind top schools send to exceptional applicants before the official decision. My Uncle Ray treated it like a papal decree. He printed it out and framed it. I am not exaggerating. The framed letter was hanging in his hallway before Derek had officially been admitted. Thanksgiving that year was at my grandparents' house. My grandfather still alive then, but fading. My grandmother still present enough to make her cornbread stuffing from memory. 22 family members around tables pushed together in the dining room. The good china. The good candles. My Aunt Donna's husband, talking too loudly about real estate. My Uncle Ray stood up midway through the meal, which was unusual. He was not a man who made toasts. He reserved his words for situations where they could generate return on investment. He talked about Derek for 4 minutes. I counted. The MIT likely letter, the future it represented, the Whitfield name finally reaching the kind of institution it deserved. My grandfather nodded from his chair at the head of the table, the first real emotion I'd seen on his face all evening. Then my Uncle Ray sat down and turned to my father. "There's a financial component we need to discuss," he said. Casually, like he was proposing a business arrangement, which I suppose he was. We all know Mother set aside money for Claire's education. Derek's MIT costs are substantial, and we thought since Claire has options, community college, state school, she's not going anywhere specialized. It makes sense to redirect that fund towards something with real return. I put down my fork. My father looked at his plate. "Ray," my Aunt Donna added, smoothing her napkin, "you know how much this family has invested in Derek. Claire is a bright girl, of course she is. But be realistic. Film school, documentary work, that's not a career. That's a very expensive way to end up back home in 5 years. Derek's trajectory is different. Some investments are just worth more than others." My grandmother looked up from the end of the table. She'd been quiet through most of the meal, struggling that day, drifting in and out. But something in the room reached her. She looked directly at me with sudden clarity. One of those windows of recognition that come less and less frequently as the disease progresses. "Claire," she said, her voice was steady, "that money is yours." Nobody responded to her. The table moved around her like water around a stone. "Dad," my father said quietly, "what do you think?" My grandfather considered for a moment. "Ray's built something real. Derek has a real shot. Claire." He glanced at me, not unkindly, but with the same fond indifference I'd known my whole life. "Claire will land on her feet. She always does." I looked at my father. I waited for him to say something, to point out that the money wasn't his to give, or Ray's to take, or anyone's to redirect, to remind them that his mother was sitting at the same table watching this happen. He didn't say anything. "Dad," I said, "that money is mine. Grandma left it for me specifically, for my education." "Honey," my Aunt Donna said, her voice taking on that particular softness that means the opposite of soft. "Don't make this awkward. We're family. Derek needs this more than you do right now. You can take out loans. Everyone does. I need it too." I kept my voice even. It was put in trust for me. It's not a family pool. Derek hadn't said a word. He was eating his dinner with the peaceful focus of someone who already knew how this would end. My Uncle Ray looked at me with something that wasn't quite contempt, but was adjacent to it. "Claire, you're a smart girl. But let's not pretend your 5-year plan is comparable to your cousin's. He's going to MIT. He's going to go into biomedical engineering. He's going to do something that matters. No offense." He said no offense the way people do when they mean every word of it. Then he said the thing that has lived in my head for 8 years. The thing I've turned over late at night when I needed to remember why I made the choices I made. "You have average ambitions, Claire. There's nothing wrong with that. Most people do. But when you have a Derek in the family, you don't get to treat average ambitions as equivalent. The resources should follow the potential." Average ambitions. I sat with that for 5 full seconds. The table was quiet, in the way that means everyone heard, and no one will intervene. Then I said, the trust is irrevocable. My grandmother's attorney set it up that way. The trustee is Horizon Bank, not any of you. I am the sole beneficiary. Those funds cannot be redirected without my consent, and they cannot be used for anyone else's education under any terms of the document. I read the whole thing last summer. Silence. My Uncle Ray's expression changed. The confident ease left his face, and something tighter took its place. You read it. I read it, I said. Grandma gave me a copy when I turned 16. She told me to know my rights. My grandmother, at the end of the table, had drifted again. Eyes distant, hands folded. But I like to think some part of her heard me. Some part of her knew that what she'd built had held. My father still hadn't spoken. I pushed back my chair, excused myself from the table, walked to the kitchen and stood at the sink looking out at the backyard. The oak tree. The tire swing that had been there since my father's childhood. The garden my grandmother could no longer tend. My father came in 3 minutes later. Claire. I didn't turn around. You put me in a difficult position tonight, he said. I turned around then. I looked at my father. This man who had raised me, who had taught me to ride a bike and helped me with geometry homework, and never once, not once, stood up for me in a room full of his family. No, I said. They put you in a difficult position, I just answered honestly. He didn't have a response to that. He went back to the table. I took my coat from the hook by the door and I called a friend to pick me up, and I did not go back for dessert. The rest of the year was cold in ways that had nothing to do with weather. My Uncle Ray stopped inviting us to events. My Aunt Donna sent a card for my graduation that said congratulations and nothing else. My father and I existed in the same house like two people waiting for something to end. I used my trust to attend the state university. Journalism and media studies, with a minor in history. I lived on campus, which cost more than commuting, but I needed the distance. I took out small loans to cover the gap. I worked part-time at the campus library, then at a local news station doing production work for entry-level pay. My father never asked how it was going. I graduated in 4 years with a 3.6 GPA and a short documentary I'd made about displaced workers in the Rust Belt that won a Regional Student Film Award. It was picked up by a small nonprofit media outlet and screened at a film festival in Cincinnati. Nobody from my family came to the screening. I went with my roommate and her mom. And her mom cried at the end and hugged me and said, "You made something that matters." And I drove home thinking about how much it meant to hear that from someone who had no reason to say it, except that it was true. Here's what was happening with Derek during those same years. As I learned through the careful observations of my grandmother's oldest friend, a retired schoolteacher named Barbara, who had known Ruth Whitfield for 50 years and felt, I think, a personal obligation to keep me informed. Derek had been admitted to MIT. Full acceptance in December of our senior year. Derek had lasted 14 months before withdrawing. Barbara delivered this information over the phone about 2 years after Thanksgiving, in the same measured tone she used for everything, as if the facts should be allowed to speak without editorial. "He's taking time off," she said. "His parents are saying it's a leave of absence." She paused. "It's been 8 months. I didn't say what I was thinking." Which was, the kid who everyone said could change the world couldn't hold it together for 2 semesters. I found out later, and Barbara confirmed this, that what happened was not a dramatic collapse, but a very quiet one. Derek had been the most extraordinary person in every room he'd ever been in until MIT, where extraordinary was the baseline, and extraordinary alone was not enough. He had exceptional test scores and almost no tolerance for being wrong, for starting over, for the slow and humbling work of learning something genuinely difficult. His father had raised him to believe that intelligence was a destination. MIT was trying to teach him it was a starting point. Some students flourish in that gap. Derek didn't. He came home to Tulsa. He took some classes at the community college, the same one my father had once suggested I attend instead of using my trust. And then stopped. He worked at his father's company in some undefined capacity. He told people he was reassessing his direction, The reassessment lasted 4 years. My Uncle Ray stopped bringing up MIT at family gatherings. Then he stopped coming to family gatherings. Then there weren't really family gatherings anymore, because my grandfather had died, and my grandmother was in memory care full-time, and the house on Midtown had been sold to pay for her care. There is something I want to tell you about that house being sold. I was 24 when it happened. I drove out to Tulsa and spent one last afternoon in the empty rooms, the cream-colored walls, the kitchen where my grandmother had asked me what I was reading, the hallway where I used to sit on the stairs and listen to the adults argue and wonder if I was imagining the way they looked right through me. I stood in the doorway of my grandmother's old bedroom, and I talked to her, even though she wasn't there. I told her what I was doing, the documentary work, the small victories, the loans I was paying off slowly, the story ideas that kept me up at night because I couldn't stop thinking about how to tell them well. I told her I was okay. I told her I was more than okay. I told her I was more than okay. I didn't know yet how true that was going to become. The project that changed everything was not the project I expected. I'd been working for 3 years as a freelance documentary producer, scraping together contracts from nonprofits, small networks, and independent production companies. I was making a living, barely. I had a one-bedroom apartment in Kansas City, and a car with 110,000 miles on it, and a notebook full of story ideas I didn't yet have the resources to pursue. The project was a 6-part documentary series about women who'd been pushed out of industries they'd built. Engineers, scientists, educators, entrepreneurs who'd had their work minimized, their credit taken, their funding redirected toward male colleagues with louder voices and better connections. It was personal research. I knew it when I started. A regional public broadcaster picked it up. Then a larger streaming platform expressed interest. I spent 14 months making that series. I interviewed 43 women across 12 states. I slept in cheap motels and drove thousands of miles and cried in my car twice, both times after interviews with women in their 60s who had never been asked to tell their story before. The series was called Quiet Credit. It came out in the spring of my 29th year. By the end of the first week, it had been covered in 3 national publications. By the end of the month, a production company in Los Angeles had reached out about a feature follow-up. By the end of that year, the series had won 2 documentary awards, and I had a development deal that changed the floor of my financial life permanently. I didn't buy a helicopter. I want to be clear about that, because what I did do was quieter and, I think, more suited to who I am. What I did was start a foundation. I named it the Ruth Whitfield Fund. Its purpose is simple: emergency grants for women in creative and educational fields whose funding has been disrupted by family circumstances, by economic shocks, by the particular kind of theft that doesn't get called theft because it happens at a dinner table among people who call themselves family. The first grant cycle supported 11 women. A single mother in Memphis, finishing her teaching credential. A woman in her 40s, in rural Ohio, starting over after a divorce that had left her with nothing. A 20-year-old in Albuquerque, who wanted to study graphic design and had been told by her family that it was not a real path. I know something about being told your path isn't real. The Whitfield family reunion was not my idea. It was organized by my Aunt Donna, who sent a group email in February with the subject line, Family Reconnection. Something about family being important, about getting older, about how scattered everyone had become. My grandfather had been gone for 5 years. My grandmother had passed away the previous October, quietly in her sleep, in the memory care facility where she'd lived for 4 years. I almost didn't go. It was my college roommate Maya who talked me into it. She had grown up in a family with its own version of the same architecture. The favorite son, the overlooked daughter, the grandmother who tried to compensate, and she understood it in a way that didn't require explanation. "You're not going for them," she said. "You're going for yourself. You're going so you can look at it clearly, from where you actually are now, and stop carrying the version of that table where you were 17 and silent." She was right. I told her I wanted to bring something. She said she'd drive, The reunion was held at my Aunt Donna's house in a suburb of Tulsa, a large, carefully decorated home that communicated wealth and the specific way of people who need others to notice it. Matching outdoor furniture, a catered spread, a banner across the back fence that said Whitfield family in block letters, as if anyone there might forget. There were maybe 30 people spread across the backyard when Maya and I arrived. Cousins, I recognized by shape but not by name. Aunts and uncles who had aged in the particular way of people who've been comfortable their whole lives, softening at the edges. I saw my Uncle Ray first. He was heavier than I remembered, standing near the drink table with the careful stillness of a man who knows his standing in the room has shifted and hasn't figured out how to adjust yet. His wife stood beside him, pearls at her throat, eyes moving around the party in quick professional assessments. Derek was there, near the back fence, holding a beer and looking at his phone. He was 30 now. He was wearing a collared shirt with the sleeves rolled up, the kind of carefully casual presentation that means someone dressed for an impression. He looked, I thought, like someone performing the role of a person who has things under control. He didn't see me yet. My father was sitting at a table under the oak at the side of the yard. He looked older than I'd expected. His hair had gone gray. He was talking to a cousin I vaguely remembered, nodding along to something with the same patient, vacant attention he'd turned on me my entire childhood. He saw me and something moved across his face. Not guilt exactly, something more complicated. Something like the recognition that time has a direction and you can't always see where it's taking you until it arrives. I nodded at him. He nodded back. My Aunt Donna emerged from the house with the bright professional warmth of a woman who has hosted many events and knows how to fill silences before they have a chance to grow. Claire, she put her hands on my arms, the greeting of someone who wants the form of a hug without the commitment. You look wonderful. And this must be a friend? Maya, I said. My closest friend for the last 12 years. My Aunt Donna smiled at Maya with the smiles she kept for people outside the family hierarchy. I found a seat. I got a drink. I watched the party arrange itself the way families do, according to invisible rankings that everyone understands and no one acknowledges. And then Derek came over. He stood across the table from me for a moment, before sitting down, like he was checking that the chair was solid. Hey Claire. Hey Derek. He turned his beer in his hands. I heard you've been doing some stuff with documentaries. Yeah, I said. Some stuff. He nodded. That's cool. He paused. I wanted to talk to you about something. He looked up. I've been working on a project. A kind of personal project. I want to make a documentary. About gifted education, actually. About kids who get labeled early and how that messes with them later. I looked at him for a long moment. He had the grace to seem slightly uncomfortable. I heard what he was really saying. I heard it under the words in the tilt of his jaw and the careful casualness of his hands, and the fact that he'd come to find me instead of waiting for me to find him. I said, "That sounds like an interesting subject," I thought. He stopped, started again. "I thought maybe you could help me get it made. I know you have connections now with the foundation and the production company and everything. I thought maybe you could point me somewhere. Or if there's like a grant program at the Ruth Whitfield Fund that covers..." I let him finish the sentence. I thought he deserved to finish it. The Ruth Whitfield Fund, I said, supports women in creative and educational fields who've had their funding disrupted. It's specifically designed for that. Oh. He absorbed this. Right. But, I said, and I watched something in him shift, hope maybe, or at least alertness. I run a mentorship program separately through my production company. It's for emerging documentary filmmakers who are in the early stages of a project. It's competitive. You'd submit an application like everyone else. Go through the same review process, no special consideration. He looked at me. I could see him calculating whether this was a kindness or a rebuke. The answer was that it was neither. It was simply what it was. I added, if your project is good and your application is strong, it'll move forward. If it isn't, it won't. That's the only variable. He nodded slowly. Okay. He stood up. Thanks, Claire. He walked away, and I watched him go, and I thought about the boy in the blazer at Thanksgiving who had eaten his dinner in peaceful silence while his family dismantled my future around him. And the man walking back across his aunt's backyard now, carrying the weight of a potential he'd spent 12 years not living up to. I didn't feel vindicated, I want to be honest about that. I didn't feel the clean satisfaction I'd imagined as a teenager when I rehearsed versions of this moment in my head. I felt something quieter, something that had to do with how much distance there is between 17 and 30, and what you learn in that distance about the difference between what people do to you and what you do with it. My Aunt Donna made a toast at the end of the afternoon. She thanked everyone for coming. She said something about family being the foundation of everything. She held up her glass and everyone drank. My father caught me alone near the side gate as I was heading to the car. He looked at me and he said, I heard about the series, Quiet Credit. Your cousin Barbara's daughter watched it. I waited. It was very good, he said. I looked it up. Something in my chest did something complicated. I said, thank you. He said he stalked. I didn't say the right things when you were growing up. I know that. I know I didn't. I looked at my father, this man who had sat at a table and let his family take what was mine and had never once stood up to say that was wrong. This man who had looked at my plans with patient indifference for 20 years. This man who was standing at a side gate at a family reunion telling me, at 30 years old, that he hadn't said the right things. I know, I said. I know you know. He nodded. He seemed to understand that this was all there was, that an acknowledgement after the fact is not an apology and not an erasure, but it's also not nothing. We walked back toward the parking area together in a silence that was different from all the silences we'd accumulated before. Not comfortable, exactly. But honest. Maya was waiting by the car. She had the look of someone who had been watching from a careful distance. You okay? She asked. I think so, I said. We drove back through Tulsa, past the Midtown neighborhood, past the street where my grandmother's house used to be. There is a different family there now. The white shutters have been painted blue. The porch looks the same. I thought about the notebook my grandmother kept. The ideas I told her that she'd written down, I'd found it in a box of her things after she died. 11 pages of her careful schoolteacher handwriting, documenting the plans and thoughts of a 17-year-old girl that her granddaughter wanted someone to take seriously. The last entry, dated 3 months before her diagnosis, read, Claire says she wants to make documentaries about forgotten people. I think she will. I think she'll be very good at it. I think she'll be very good at it. I think she already is. I've kept that notebook on my desk ever since. It's nothing special to look at. A small blue spiral notebook with a coffee stain on the cover and a cracked spine. But it's the clearest proof I have that someone saw me before I saw myself. My grandmother was a second-grade teacher for 31 years. She never made more than $38,000 in a single year. She drove the same car for 16 years, packed her lunch every day, and quietly saved enough money to give one granddaughter a chance that her family would have taken from her. She did not live to see Quiet Credit. She was already deep in the fog by the time I finished it, but I screened it for her anyway on a laptop in the memory care facility, sitting beside her bed. She didn't follow the story. But at one point, she turned and looked at me with that clear window recognition, suddenly, briefly, completely present. And she said, Claire, you're working. Yes, I said. I am. She patted my hand and looked back at the screen. That was enough. That has always been enough. There's something I've been thinking about since the reunion. About what it means to be told your ambitions are average. About what the word average is actually doing in a sentence like that. What it's meant to accomplish. I think it's meant to end the conversation, to close the door before the other person has a chance to see what's on the other side of it. People who call other people's ambitions average are not making a prediction. They're making a choice. They're choosing not to look. My Uncle Ray looked at me at 22 family members' table and made a choice not to look. My father sat next to him and made the same choice. Derek ate his dinner and made the same choice by omission. None of that was about my ambitions. It was about theirs. About what they needed me to be so that Derek could be what they'd decided he was. It took me years to understand that. It took me longer to stop being angry about it. I'm still working on the second part, if I'm being honest. But the anger is smaller now. It has less room in me than it used to, because the other things have grown. The Ruth Whitfield Fund has provided emergency grants to 47 women in its first 2 years of operation. 3 of them have used those grants to complete educational programs. 1 is finishing a nursing degree. 1 just got her teaching credential. 1 is making her first short film. That last one sent me a handwritten card. She said she'd been told her whole life that making things wasn't a real career. She said she'd grown up watching her family pour its resources into her brother's real future, while her own plans were treated like a phase she'd grow out of. She said the grant felt like the first time someone had looked at her and said, "Yes, this is worth something." I read that card at my desk next to my grandmother's notebook. I thought about what my grandmother told me when I was 15. That wanting to tell forgotten stories wasn't a hobby, that it was a calling. I thought about how she was right. How she was right before I had any evidence that she was right. How she simply looked at me and decided to believe it, and then took every quiet, practical step available to her to make sure I had a foundation to build on. Some people love loudly. They make speeches at Thanksgiving and hang framed letters in their hallways and open expensive champagne for the children they've decided are worth celebrating. My grandmother loved like a second-grade teacher, patiently, specifically, with close attention to what the individual child actually needed, without fanfare. With documentation. She wrote down what I said. She updated her will. She made sure the trust was irrevocable. She knew something that I've only recently come to understand fully, that the people who need to protect you most carefully are not always the ones with the most power. Sometimes they're just the ones paying the closest attention. I still wear her reading glasses on a chain around my neck sometimes. Not to use, my vision is fine. Just to carry something of hers. Just to have that small piece of her close to where I'm going. She believed in me before I'd done anything worth believing in. That kind of faith doesn't expire. You carry it forward. You build with it. And if you're lucky, you figure out a way to pass it on. That's what the fund is. That's what Quiet Credit was. That's what I'm building, one project at a time, in the name of a woman who packed her lunch for 31 years and saved enough to change one granddaughter's life. If you've ever been the one at the table they talked around, if you've ever had your plans called average by someone who needed you to be smaller than you were, if you've ever sat in a room where no one stood up for you and decided quietly, privately, to stand up for yourself instead, I want you to know that decision compounds. Quietly, slowly, the way my grandmother's savings compounded over decades. You don't see it for a long time, and then one day you're sitting across from the person who told you your ambitions were average, and they're asking you for help. And you realize that the room has rearranged itself completely without anyone announcing it. You don't need to rub their faces in it. The rearrangement speaks for itself. You just have to be patient enough to still be in the room when it happens. My grandmother knew that. She didn't live to see the room rearrange, but she set it in motion. She set me in motion. And the least I can do, the very least, is keep moving. I've thought a lot about what my uncle actually meant when he said I had average ambitions. He meant it as a verdict, a permanent one. He looked at a 17-year-old girl with a notebook full of ideas and decided, in the span of a dinner conversation, that she had already reached her ceiling. What he didn't understand, what I didn't fully understand until much later, is that ambition doesn't announce itself at 17. It compounds, quietly, incrementally, through every small decision to keep going when the easier choice is to stop. My grandmother understood that. She didn't put her faith in test scores, or framed letters, or the kind of potential that needs a blazer and a prep school to feel real. She put her faith in consistency. in the particular kind of person who shows up and does the work even when no one is watching, even when no one is keeping score. That's not luck. That's cause and effect, operating on a timeline that most people aren't patient enough to wait for. Derek didn't fail because he wasn't intelligent. He failed because he had been raised to believe that intelligence was the whole equation. That if you were gifted enough, the work would eventually become easy, and that difficulty itself was a signal that you were in the wrong place. Nobody had ever taught him to sit inside difficulty and build something anyway. Nobody had thought he needed that lesson. So when MIT handed it to him without warning, he had no tools for it. I had those tools because I had no other choice. When you grow up being told that your path is impractical, that your ambitions are average, that the resources will flow towards someone more deserving, you learn to build without resources. You learn to move without permission. You learn that no one is coming to open the door, so you'd better figure out where the door is and what it would take to open it yourself. That's not a sad story. That's actually the most useful education I ever received. The people who called my ambitions average handed me something they didn't intend to. They handed me the clarity that comes from knowing no one is in your corner but yourself, and the quiet woman at the end of the table who kept a notebook and updated her will. When you have that clarity early, you stop wasting energy on approval and start spending it on the work. Integrity is what you do when the outcome is uncertain and no one is going to reward you for it. I made quiet credit because the stories in it mattered, not because I knew anyone would watch it. I started the Ruth Whitfield Fund because it was the right use of what I'd been given, not because it would reflect well on me. Those choices didn't guarantee anything, but they built something, a body of work, a reputation, a way of moving through the world that couldn't be taken at a dinner table or redirected by someone else's ambition. That's what my grandmother was trying to protect when she made that trust irrevocable. Not just the money, the possibility, the chance for her granddaughter to find out what she was actually made of without anyone siphoning off the foundation before she had a chance to build. If you've been told your path isn't worth the investment, I want you to sit with this. The people who said that were not making a prediction. They were making a choice about what they were willing to see. Their choice doesn't determine your ceiling. It only determines theirs. Keep building. Keep the notebook. Do the work that matters to you before you have proof that it will matter to anyone else. Cause and effect are patient. They will find you eventually, not as a reward, but as a natural consequence of who you chose to become when no one was watching. That's the only story worth telling, and you're the only one who gets to tell it.